know, I went to seminary at Seattle University, which is, many of you may not know, is a Catholic institution. It's Jesuit, in fact. Now the seminary, like actually many Jesuits, was quite progressive and open to people of all faiths. But despite all the good things that I'd heard about it, I was rather nervous. It was a Christian institution after all, and while I was a big fan of Jesus, I was also a shamanic practitioner, and my theology was one that it didn't accept salvation theology. I was worried that I wouldn't be accepted, I wouldn't be welcome, that my own theology in particular wouldn't be. And I had been very clear in my interview, so that I knew that they did accept me. So I thought, okay, well, I'm just going to be open and out about this. But I still remember walking into that very first class on that first day being really nervous. I remember I looked around the room and I was kind of like trying to see, who I want to sit next to, as you're trying to find people, right? And I remember there was this young woman that I saw. For me, she was young. She was mid-20s, mid to late 20s. And she was standing there, and she had really long hair, very striking. She had really long hair. But the cool thing about her was that she was wearing a cape, okay? And not only was it just a cape, but she had a Lord of the Rings pin that held it together. And I'm like, oh, yes, excellent. Another geek just like me. And I'm thinking, for some reason, I associate the long hair and the cape with sort of some pagan leanings or something. So I'm thinking, oh, this is wonderful. So someone like me, and I sat down, introduced myself, and we had this wonderful chat about Lord of the Rings, and I just was so happy that I thought, oh, here, I found someone who probably thinks differently just like me, other than some of the mainline Christians, and we would stick together. Oh, what a great first day. Well, the class was on Christian scriptures, and I remember after about 20 minutes of the lecture, the professor mentioned something about the Apostle Paul. Now, if some of you don't know who that is, all you really need to know is that he is someone who's often quoted in anti-gay rhetoric. So I kind of leaned over to her, and I kind of whispered conspiratorially, "Doesn't Paul sometimes just piss you off?" I remember the look she gave me was sort of like shocked. I remember blinking like a number of times at me. And I remember sort of like, I wonder why she seems surprised. And honestly, I didn't think much of her reaction. I thought maybe she hadn't heard me, or she thought I was being rude for interrupting the lecture. My assumptions about her were so strong, and she was silent, that it didn't occur to me that I might have said anything to upset her. And sure enough, actually, I had. As I found out later, she grew up Pentecostal and had a huge respect for Paul. It had never occurred to her in her life. I remember her saying this, "Paul? Christian Paul? It just never occurred to me, never heard it. She'd never heard anything like that. And certainly never heard anybody kind of speak sort of disparagingly about him. And she too had been torn between wanting to stay friends with me, she too was looking to meet someone, or wanting to admit that she liked and admired Paul. So she didn't say anything. Well, luckily, Deb and I went on to be really good friends. She was one of my best friends in seminary, and we are still very close friends, even though she lives now outside of New York City. But we got past that moment. But it was a good lesson for us, and we laugh about it now. We talk about how all the assumptions that I made, that how did I go from assuming liking Lord of the Rings to pagan theology? I just, somehow we make these leaps in our minds somehow, that they must think like myself. And she also was like, why didn't I say something? So she learned a lesson about speaking up. Now, making assumptions and remaining silent when we disagree, these are classic problems in communications, particularly among us humans, right? Because it's human nature to want to belong to a group, to make friends, to have and be in relationships with one another. It's a really basic human need. And it's, as Kenneth said in our opening words today, it's the reason of cities, of homes, of assemblies, of the houses of worship. But how do we choose who to be with? We assume that someone who thinks like us will be the best person to be in relationship with. So sometimes when we meet someone new, we send out a kind of a secret handshake, right? We think that they might actually know this handshake, and oftentimes it's in the form of a joke, and often at someone else's expense. It's kind of like saying, so I don't like these people, do you want to join my club of people that we don't like those ones over there? And it's very unconscious, very unconscious. We often don't know that we're doing it. But I invite you sometime to watch yourself when you're in sort of a little bit of an uncomfortable situation and you want to belong, or you're trying to help someone else feel like they belong. Sometimes we think we're being clever or funny with our joke, and if someone does think like us, well then we are, right? But if they don't, then we actually may be excluding them. And that's exactly what I was doing with my friend Deb. I wanted her to join my club of like-mindedness, that of being sort of anti-Paul that I was at that time. I've come to understand and appreciate Paul. But I wanted a friend. And there's nothing wrong with wanting to belong. The problem is the way that we often go about it in our culture, right? We try to find people who are, we say, like-minded. Only like-minded has been sort of reduced to political or religious opinions. We don't take into account often other things. And it's gotten so extreme that we go from, so that person over there doesn't think the same as me, to they must be evil. We do this in a heartbeat. We are hardwired to think this way in our culture through dualistic media, religion, politics that likes to take extreme sides on issues. And honestly, this is why we have a Congress that's in a standstill right now, because both sides are so extreme in everything that they have this sort of, if you don't think like I do, I have to hate you and do everything in my power to bring you to your knees. Compromise or listening are considered weaknesses, and people are encouraged to take sides. When it seems like every time someone voices a differing opinion, whenever this happens, whenever we voice a different opinion, and it leads to the excommunication or hate speech, is it ending wonder that Deb didn't want to speak up when I insulted her religion? Has our culture come to the point that we are so afraid to offer a differing opinion because to do so means that we are shunned, disliked, or shamed? Can we in this country learn to have healthy, respectful debate, learn to listen and respond to one another respectfully? Does taking a stand on an issue have to mean my way or the highway? Well, I think that Unitarian Universalism has an answer to these questions. And it came from a Unitarian who lived actually about 500 years ago in Eastern Europe, in this tiny little country nested in a forested valley surrounded by mountains. Now, Transylvania is more often known as the birthplace of vampires, but it is also, I find this, I don't know, the only word I can think of is paradoxical, but I'm not sure. It's kind of an interesting contrast. It's also the birthplace of religious freedom, and most people don't know this. In the 16th century, when the rest of Europe was duking it out over who had the best theology and persecution was rampant everywhere, the Unitarian king, John Sigismund, along with his counselor, Francis David, issued the first law of religious freedom that was ever in the world, and was called the Edict of Torda. It allowed each religion to practice freely in the country without fear of persecution. You can understand, this was absolutely radical for its time. It had never been done before. Francis David, the king's counselor, he was this great orator, and he would draw crowds of thousands, whether they were Lutherans or Catholics or Unitarians or even Jews. They were actually close to the Ottoman Empire as well. They were Muslims as well. And he had these inspiring and compassionate words, and his most famous words are these that have come down to us in history. He said this: "We need not think alike to love alike."